So, my name is Antonis Skourtis. I'm an undergraduate student of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, under the Faculty of Electrical Engineering and Computer Engineering. I will be presenting adaptive hierarchical regular binning, which is a package that I've been developing alongside my colleagues, Dr. Dimitris Floros, Professor Nikos Pitsianis, and Professor Xiao Baisan. So this presentation is split into three main parts. And the first one is the introduction, where I will be presenting the main functionality of the package alongside some downstream scenarios so that the package can be used. I will also present benchmarks and the basic properties of the package. The next one is user interface and code snippets. And in this section, I will show some basic examples of its usage and in a setting of, in a rudimentary setting that will explain how the package is used. Lastly, the development part is where we will take a deeper dive into the implementation details of the package. And that's all for the outline. All right, so adaptive hierarchical regular binning, or ARB for short, the H is not is silent, computes a hierarchical tree that bins particles into cubes while also adapting to the data content density. So this is actually the main functionality of ARB. And ARB can be used by downstream tasks, such as nonlinear dimension reduction, which is a process that utilizes near neighbors, and ARB offers efficient queries that speed up such searches. One example is the Swiss roll depicted in the images to the right. And the Swiss roll is a 2D structure, two-dimensional structure, embedded in a three-dimensional space. So nonlinear dimension reduction basically unrolls that structure, revealing its true shape. And such structures can exist in higher dimensions and aims to facilitate these cases, the higher dimensional ones. So ARB accepts a source and the target set of particles in a high dimensional space alongside the two control parameters, Lmax and Pmax. These parameters control the maximum number of partition levels of the space. And the other one, the Pmax, controls the population threshold of the inner nodes. And by inner nodes, I mean the non-terminal nodes of the computed tree. So yes, the result is an annotated tree structure. And by annotated, I mean that there are several accessor functions that can provide useful information to the user. Such accessor functions can retrieve the particles that are contained within the bin, or perhaps the neighboring boxes of the bin. So spatially, each node of this tree can be represented by a hypercube, and parent hypercubes contain their children, as seen in the example image we have in the slide. Note that empty boxes are not depicted since they are not computed. And note that this is a three-dimensional example, but ARB aims to solve higher dimensional problems. This is only for demonstration. So the output tree can be queried efficiently. And such queries can be, for example, get leaf box, which for a random particle inside a high dimensional space retrieves the smallest tree node that contains that particle. Another query can be, for example, a get neighbors of a box, which retrieves the boxes directly adjacent to the queried box. Getting the neighbors of a box can result into interaction lists for each point within the tree, or in other words, an interaction matrix for all the points in the tree. Filtering out far-field interactions is what ARB actually can offer, without computing the pairwise distances of that far-field interactions. So To the right, the image depicts an end-to-end problem where all interactions would have to be computed in an exhaustive search, but using ARB, only the gray areas needs to be computed. And the blue areas are the actual results of the interactions. So here I will be presenting some downstream task scenarios. And there is a plethora of tasks that ARB can be utilized for. And keep in mind that tasks of high dimensionality is the target goal of ARB. So the first one is image processing, and more specifically, superpixel segmentation, which can be used for data compression. Data like these are not two-dimensional, rather they are five-dimensional. They have 2 dimensions for pixel space and 3 dimensions for color information. Another example is the one to the top right, which is a data set of gene cell barcodes, and such data sets can be utilized to find similarities between cells. But these data sets have really high dimensionalities, and even though there are techniques like PCA that lowers these dimensions of the data, the result is in reality still high dimensional. Another example is the robotics, down to the left part. And in the robotics field, collision detections are of paramount importance in order to are of paramount importance. Data sets of the robotics side of things tend to have large dimensionalities, since its degree of freedom adds a new dimension to the data. So we already talked about nonlinear dimension reduction, but another example is the one in the middle. And we already stated that ARB can benefit such cases. The last one is the down right one, the n-body simulations. And for high dimensionality features, such as 3 dimensions for time, for space, sorry, and accounting for velocities and accelerations, we have a high dimensionality data set. So in all cases, the high dimensionality is noted, and ARB focuses on this and tries to solve these kinds of problems. So there are several packages out there that are doing similar tasks to ARB. That is, they partition space into regular bins, and the partition space into regular bins. So some of these packages, the notable ones, are octtrees.jl, regiontrees.jl, parallelbarnshat.jl, and collisiondetection.jl. So why use ARB then? So we have designed ARB to facilitate, as already stated, high dimensionality data, and some of these packages either implicitly or explicitly limit their dimensions, their input data dimensions. Some also allocate prohibiting amounts of memory for larger data sets and more dimensions. And there is more potential in how we parallelize ARB. We also can, through ARB, provide users with more useful information, such as the queries I mentioned in the previous slides. And ARB also enables users to define user-defined information and application-defined information to attach it on each node of the tree in order to help data flow between these nodes, information flow between these nodes. We will see examples of this. So in this figure, we show how ARB scales. This figure shows how ARB scales in terms of number of dimensions per particle and number of particles as well. ARB scales linearly with the number of dimensions, and it also scales linearly with the number of particles. So this also demonstrates how we are able to cater to more dimensions since the linear scaling. So the benchmarks we did are up to 30 dimensions and 10 million particles. And to our knowledge, ARB is the only package that does regular spatial partitioning and binning on such large input data sets, more than 20 dimensions. So in this one, we saw how the parallel implementation of ARB speeds up in comparison to the sequential one. So using 8 cores, we can see we have up to 7x speed up. And note that these are preliminary benchmarks, and further tuning, with further tuning, we expect even better results. All right. So ARB partitions space into d-dimensional cubes that offer geometric accuracy control, and it does that process up to L max levels of partitioning. ARB also bins the corresponding particles into nodes and uses Pmax to control the maximum population for inner nodes, that is for non-terminal nodes. So in the graph to the right, it is depicted a six-dimensional particles with at most of 4 levels of partitioning. This is an array of projections, and each column and row represents a dimension. The figure also emphasizes the ability of ARB to adapt to high-dimensional data and their density in that space. Also, the total number of boxes will always be lower than 2n, where n is the number of particles, and no empty boxes will be registered. So in terms of memory, ARB allocates a small multiple of the input data size in the beginning, and each particle is relocated to the corresponding bit and at runtime. So bin sizes are determined internally in adaptation to the data density. All right. Coding in Julia made our lives really easy. So using its multiple dispatch and the excellent package abstract trees, we were able to implement simple functions in order to get iteration schemes that are otherwise harder to implement. We also take advantage of the dynamic type system, and we don't limit ourselves to a single type implementation. And also we utilize Julia's 1.8 dynamic scheduler, and it played actually a major role in speeding up our code, since the parallel implementation of ARB spawns tasks that are not balanced. Also, Julia enables us to port our parallel implementations to different platforms, and this is a point for future work. So, some examples of how we use ARB. And the first one is the tree construction itself. And the tree construction accepts an input matrix X and 2 thresholds max L and max P. The ARB function gets to have an exclamation mark since it permutes the input matrix, but we offer this permutation as a field from the tree, so users can permute back to the original matrix. The third example shows how population control using max P at non-terminal nodes works. And that is that non-terminal nodes should have populations smaller or equal to max P at all times. The last one, first, let's describe what centered side length is. Each node spatially has a center and a side length. and all points within that node must be contained within that specified box. So this code snippet actually checks if that is the case, which it is. All right, so the next a bit more interesting example is how we find the center of mass for each node. This is assuming that all points are unit mass. And we iterate over all nodes. And for the leaf case, we compute the average of the points and the count of the points themselves as well. And we set it to the context of the node, which is the user context I already mentioned. So for the aggregate case, for the recursive case, let's say, we iterate over the children of the node, and getting their context, we can perform aggregations to get the complete result. We also set the context of that node as well to the result that we just computed, and that's all. The post-ordered DFS traversal is actually something that abstract trees enables us to do, and we traverse the tree in a post-order manner in order to make sure that children nodes are visited first before their parents do. So they have their context computed. Another example is how we find the nearest neighbor within a search radius. So this is not an iteration scheme, but rather it's a recursion. And for the base case, for the leaf case, we compute the pairwise distances of all points to the query. And we find the minimum of that. If that minimum distance is within the search radius, then we return it and return the index of the point, of that distance as well. So for the recursive case, we again iterate over all children, but first we sort them in terms of their box distance to the query. We also filter out some children that their box are not in the search radius. For the rest children, we search the tree recursively and update the radius and index as needed. All right, so we talked about the use cases of how we might use ARB, and we showed examples of how we actually use it. Now we will take a look to the distinctive properties of ARB. There are two key processes, spatial partitioning and spatial binning. The spatial partitioning process refers to box creations based on the maximum level and maximum particle populations. So leaf boxes are either located to level L max or higher levels because they're because of low population. Also note that empty boxes are not registered. ARB does particle binning as well, meaning that nodes are aware of their content, and we use Z code or Morton order to encode each particle. And based on that encoding, we relocate the particles into the designated boxes, into their designated boxes. So there are two ways of actually doing the binning, of actually doing the particle binning. And the first one utilizes a fixed recursion depth and works better for uniformly distributed data. The second one uses a variable recursion depth, and it does not assume the data distribution, but rather it adapts to it. And it also utilizes the ECP scheme that I will present in the next slide. All right, so before explaining the ECP scheme, let's figure out what the graph on the right is. So its dark square is considered to be 1, and its blank spot is considered to be 0. So this is binary information. Each column is a Morton code, and Morton codes are computed by each particle in the tree, by each particle in the input space. So the D by L rows that we have there is in terms of D, the dimensionality of the input, and L as in the maximum level of the tree. So the first step of the ECP scheme is E, which stands for encoding. So ARB encodes, as I said, each element to its corresponding Morton code, resulting in this D by L binary word for its particle. The second step is counting, and ARB. The second step is counting, and ARB selects the most significant bits depicted by the horizontal lines in the graph. And it also counts based on these selected bits. After the count, this produces binaries for each distinct set of bits, and this is depicted by the vertical lines. After we have computed the boundary for each distinct set of bits, the P step of ECP takes hold, which stands for permuting. So ARB relocates all particles to their designated places within their corresponding boundaries. So all elements with the same D significant bits are placed in consecutive memory addresses, and this actually forms subarrays that are mutually exclusive from one another and can be worked in parallel in later iterations of this process. So the actual last step of ECP is the repetition or recursion. So we recurse for the C part and the P part by selecting the next D most significant bytes in line and permuting them in place only within the boundaries set by the previous iterations, by the previous recursions. So in this slide, we explain how the control flow works and how we do performance tuning for the ECP. There are two main control variables, the P2P and P2S. P2P stands for parallel to parallel, and P2S stands for parallel to sequential. The P2P variable controls whether or not parallel counting and parallel permuting will be used, while the P2S controls whether or not tasks for each subarray will be spawned in parallel or not. So if a subarray that was formed by ECP is not big enough, then the overhead of thread spawning is greater than the counting and permuting itself. So there is no benefit in using the parallel implementation for such problems. So in the end, we conclude to an implementation solution that utilizes a cascading scheme, and problems that involve a really large number of particles will be counted and permuted in parallel, while also the created subarrays will be further processed in parallel. Smaller problems may not utilize the parallel counting and permuting, but they will spawn threads for their subarrays. And even smaller problems just run sequentially altogether, not spawning for counting permutations or their subarrays themselves. So the recursion stops either at the maximum level of the tree or when a subarray is so small, smaller than the population threshold set in the beginning, where I explained the inputs max P and max L. So a quick recap of the whole thing. ARB accommodates multi-resolution interactions with geometric accuracy control. It is built in mind it is built with high dimensionality data in mind, and it's conservative of its memory consumption. It utilizes the potential of multi-core architectures and uses Julia's abilities to adapt to abstract structures and data type, while also, of course, utilizing the Julia's dynamic scheduler introduced in 1.8. So thank you, JuliaCon 2023 for travel support. And also I would like to thank the co-chairs of this year's conference, Ranjan and Logan. Thank you all for...
Thank you very much for that. Do we have any questions?
So you mentioned particle n-body simulations as being one example. So I guess in every time step in an n-body simulation, all the particles move a little bit. So let's say you have a tree that works for a set of particles, and all the particles move a little. Are you able to quickly fix the tree, or do you have to start from scratch?
As of now, we have to start from scratch, but the benefits of not interacting with everyone in your space really beats every performance overhead that tree construction might have.
Is there any algorithm out there that can make this repair process faster than just starting from scratch?
I don't really know how to answer that since I don't know, but perhaps it's a point for further continuation of this package as well. So.
Similar question is, you have a set of points, and then you have a new point you want to add. Is there a way to add it to the data structure, or do you have to redo?
So there are plans of adding it to our implementation, but as of now, we just have to compute the whole tree again.
But there is a method of doing it?
Yes, it is. Well, you can always, if you are in your, well, if your new point is within the maximum size of the rest of the points. So if it is an inner point, you can always create a node and place it there, or place it in an existing one. And if it's outside that space, you can always extend the tree structure upwards in a fashion that the old tree is just a branch of the new, bigger tree.
I wanted to ask if you benchmarked it against anything else.
Yes.
What are the results?
We didn't want to really show the results of the other packages as well, since we only wanted to show how we fare, not how we fare, how we perform. But the benchmarks were done, and we had some good results. Do you have anything specific in mind?
Just usually when you present an algorithm, it's nice to sort of compare it to other implementations out there.
Yeah, we avoided that because we wouldn't like to compare, let's say. Anyways, yeah, we did the benchmark, we did not show them.
Other questions? Okay, let's thank Antonis again.